So we're going to do a panel discussion with Carter Phipps, Jeff Salzman, and Steve McIntosh, who are all directors of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And we're going to start off with a question from Robert Anderson. All right, here's Robert's question. How can America evolve from our current cultural mix of traditional, modern, and progressive worldviews to an integral worldview, while there is a growing political, economic, and spiritual conflict? The Institute for Cultural Evolution's Developmental Politics Project presents many interesting creative alternatives that go beyond simple compromise, but the general presentation of the Institute is rather intellectual, theoretical, and even philosophical, placing our material outside the interest area of most folks. How can we simplify some of the knowledge being presented so we can expand our influence? So, Jeff, Steve, and Carter, either of you want to take a crack at this?
I think Steve should.
I think Steve should take it first.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, I certainly want to hear from everybody on this question, but so it's a multiple question. Let me just kind of try to tackle different parts of it, right? So beginning in 2012, when Carter and I co-founded the think tank, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, our goal was to participate in and perhaps even help bring about the emergence of this integral worldview, right? Which we use many labels to describe it. Postmodern, I think it's the most descriptive. Carter hates that. I don't blame him. Post-progressive, we tried that for a while, but people misunderstood it. So the label I guess we'll use for this group is the integral worldview, just because it's familiar, but that's not necessarily our standard terminology for what we're talking about. That itself is evolving, and we don't want to oppose jargon. We want to pick up on what people are talking about in as wide a circle as possible, and have our terminology follow the usage of language. So we're working to bring this about. Carter and I strategized that one of the problems that integral philosophy could solve was political polarization. We were specifically concerned, many of you have heard this story, concerned with climate change, but after working on climate change for a while, we realized that the reason that climate change was stuck was because of an upstream problem of political polarization, right? That the issue of climate change had become a kind of a football or a marker of cultural identity. And so we wanted to focus on overcoming political polarization, which is what we've been doing really since 2014. In 2020, when I published my political philosophy book, Developmental Politics, that began a new phase of the Institute. We've done many things in the interim, but in 2020, the idea was to do our best to create a movement, right? A political movement, and to see what we could do to really persuade people. So we spent a lot of time finding ways to try to simplify and make, frame our, admittedly philosophical and intellectual content as something that people could appreciate. So for example, one trope was cultural intelligence, which, picking up off of the popularity of emotional intelligence and now many kinds of other intelligence, our strategy was that cultural intelligence was attractive because it sounded like something you needed if you wanted to be a leader, right? And, or a skill, as opposed to, not many people are ready to take on a new worldview. It's kind of a daunting proposition. So we tried that. We've also worked on simplifying, trying to make it as concise as possible. So we have a 100-word version of what our political approach is. We have a 700-word version. We have a graphical version. We had a course where I spent 9 weeks making it as simple as possible to folks who were not familiar with integral philosophy. That course is available online. So we've actually put in a lot of effort to try to simplify this as much as possible. My watchword has always been Einstein's famous quote that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so, at some point it becomes so simple that it becomes a kind of cartoon version of itself and starts to work against its, nuanced intentions. So the platform that we've created has kind of been conceptual, kind of captured in the brand Developmental Politics. And we have our website for that, and that platform is continuing. So just this morning, I did a podcast with this Washington, D.C. based group of peace builders. They wanted to know about our depolarizing GPT artificial intelligence model, relating to bringing peace to the culture war. And so I demoed it and told them the story of how we created it, and they loved that. And that generated a whole bunch of new subscriptions and interest from the New York Times. We'll see whether that goes anywhere. But we're continuing to work on popularizing and spreading, the word, so to speak, about this way of seeing, with the expectation that it will catch on, that it will gradually make its way into the culture and be given greater and greater respect. But it's what we learned is that we're really not going to be able to market our way to the second enlightenment, right? It's even if we had a gigantic budget to spend, there are many signs that that this is very much kind of ahead of its time, right? So, I can certainly blame myself for being perhaps ineffective at communicating to a larger public, but I am who I am, and I have the gifts that I have to give, and those are not all things to all people. So we're going to continue to build the platform, but one of the things that we came to a conclusion kind of together as a board of directors is that instead of trying to try to water it down more and more and more and try to get to some kind of little populist kernel that people can digest, while that's still a goal, we started attacking the other direction and realized that perhaps the best way to cultivate for emergence, right, to garden for emergence in the noosphere, is to add to the actual solid canon or body of integral philosophy itself. In other words, the core philosophy is not developed enough. It hasn't gained enough momentum. It has, too many objectionable aspects or things that are not integrated enough with the rest of, intellectual culture. And so beginning last year, the board basically told me that I need to go and write another book. And, in some ways, writing a book, for me at least, my process is so hard. It's like you go into a tunnel and you can't stop thinking about it for years. It just sort of grips you. It's a privilege, of course, to be able to write a book. And I'm very grateful to the board of directors for giving me the opportunity to focus on that, even while we still keep the platform going and, have Zoom groups and everything else. That's kind of where my focus is. And so that means that I'm not using all my energy, for example, to continue to write issue positions. Now, I hope to write issue positions in the future, but until this book is completed, I'm not writing anything substantial except for that. I need to kind of get through it, and I've got a good head of steam. It's significantly completed, but it's going to take a lot more time before it's completed. And then, it's in the publishing pipeline. So it'll be a while before this book comes out. But next, I can mention in this context that next month, April 10th, I'm going to give a preview of the presentation that I'm going to be giving in May at the Integral Conference that's being held in Denver. Some of you may be attending that. And so I'm giving a keynote presentation there about one particular chapter in the book, and I'll be, kind of rolling that out for your consideration and input next month. So there's a lot more to say about our strategy and our platform, but that's a decent answer for the moment.
Maybe I'll just jump in here, and I won't add too much. I know we need to get through various questions. But I think there's I sense in the question itself a little bit of like how, and in a few of these questions, it's like, how do we get the message out? How do we get, how do we recruit more individuals to this point of view? And that's always a worthy question. And you're right. Sometimes I think if things are intellectual and philosophical, they don't attract as many people, of course. But there's also a really important role for that as well, like Steve said, for creating that canon. And we all have to play to our strengths, whatever our strengths are. I think that's just part of the reality of any of us who are trying to engage this worldview, and the intellectual basis of it is going to play a really important role over time. The other thing I would say is that I feel like one of the things I've learned over the years, and I think, is you can't like timing culture is like timing the market. You just can't do it. You can't time culture. You don't know how we're in a moment of complexity, of division, but you just don't know the external circumstances that are going to throw a wrench in culture that's going to create a whole different moment. And it may be in 10 years, it may be in 50 years, it may be in 100 years. And I feel like, our role in some sense is to create those artifacts that are attractive and that speak to those needs in such a way that ultimately will be able to provide for those needs when those needs become incredibly important and culture turns toward them. But it's so hard. It's like you can't. It's very hard to strategize at this level. So we can speak more about that as we get through these questions. But yeah, I think we can try to create those artifacts and try to create, and you do the best you can, obviously, to speak to the audience as you see it. But I mean, look, I was part of a magazine, 10, 20 years ago that was its own form of artifact. It's very different than maybe a books or like Wilbur stuff or Steve's books or others. And that was also had a big impact. Yeah, there it is, right? Someone's sharing it. And so I'm sure there'll be more things like that in the future, and we should. And if people have visions for that, then man, more power to you, because we certainly need them.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks, Carter, Steve. I agree with all of that. I would just add one quick thing, and that is notice how the evolution of consciousness and culture is happening under its own power. Just look around and see the exhaustion that people are having with green. Look at where I see it most of all is in Twitter. And that is just the number of people who are explicitly tired of their existing worldview and are looking for something else. And understanding the disenchantment of the world that was brought on by modernity, and understand how the hypersensitization of green is its own downside. And there's just a lot of understanding that is arising in this mess. And I think as integralists, part of it, our job is to notice that and to love the mess itself. Evolution does. Evolution loves this. And, join in, fight, friend, whatever it takes. But don't just condemn the system as it's, make sure you don't condemn the system.
Great. Thanks, guys.
I could add just one more thing if I will. One of the models that we have from history about how worldviews emerge, of course, every worldview is a lesson that we can take in stride, but the emergence of modernity during the Enlightenment provides a particularly poignant example. Modernism, at least in its first century, was an elite enterprise. I mean, that is the amount of people who were actively participating in the Enlightenment was a tiny fraction of the population of Europe at the time in America, and yet it was philosophy primarily, and then followed by science and the Industrial Revolution and everything else. But it was philosophy, intellectual investigation and empirical observation that was really seminal in bringing about the evolution of that worldview. So while we want to be as popular as we can and as accessible as we can, In some ways, we can't we can't deny that at least what we have to give is an intellectual, proposition.
Excellent. All right. Next question is from Deborah Nystrom. Regarding Jonathan Haidt's foundational values work, why doesn't he include developmental stages? Who wants to take a crack at that one?
I think, Steve, you know probably more about this than I do, certainly.
Steve and I gave it our best shot in a 3-hour car ride with him.
Okay, there you go.
California coast.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt came to our 2014 conclave on political polarization held at Esalen on the Big Sur coast in California. There was about 40 luminaries who were invited to that conference, and Haidt presented his new book at the time, The Righteous Mind. And we were familiar with his theories beforehand. And then we gave him our presentation. He actually held up our paper, one of the early papers from the Institute for Cultural Evolution, called Depolarizing the American Mind. It's published. You can read it on the Developmentalist website magazine. It was kind of a prototype of much of the thinking that we've developed since then. And in his presentation, unbidden, like he never really even met us, we didn't know us, but in his slideshow to the Esalen conference, he held up our paper and said, "This is the most insightful thing I've read on polarization." And we were swooning. "Oh, Jonathan, you're so famous." So he had an affinity for what we're doing. He gave us a blurb for the paper, at least, saying, and it's on our website to this day. So, we like him. I could say that I, applaud his place in the marketplace of ideas. But I think it's, fair to say that we got some insights as to his, intellectual convictions and concerns as we were driving. I think that for purposes of just being honest with this group, one of the things that I observed about Jonathan Haidt is that he's, a kind of a world famous intellectual celebrity for a reason, that cultivating his celebrity is something that he works a lot on. And part of that is being very careful, being very political intellectually, right? So he's a staunch atheist, kind of a Steven Pinker style atheist. And, he was very concerned that he would not be perceived as endorsing or being associated with anything that the hardcore atheists might consider woo-woo, right? So I've also kind of interpreted his kind of, initial enthusiasm for, but failure to really integrate or uptake this idea of developmental levels, because it's not really intellectually respectable within mainstream academia, right? Especially elite academia like New York University, where Haidt teaches. In other words, he has been brave with respect to progressive postmodernism, and as the momentum against it has increased over the last few years, he's become more strident in his condemnations of postmodernism. But he doesn't condemn the elites who are really, the people who are, the main proponents and champions of this worldview's power. He kind of blames it on students run amok, right? So I'm not saying, I don't blame him for trying to not offend anybody and trying to play the game of, being intellectually respectable. I mean, every public figure has to do that to a degree. But I think that despite the explanatory power of developmental stages, right, postmodernism rejects that idea, right, in favor of value relativism. How can we say that one form of culture is more evolved than another, right? That's a subversive proposition to the progressive postmodern worldview. And so, Haidt is smart enough to see that if he were to adopt that and integrate that into his values theory, then he would be he'd be on the outs in terms of intellectual fashion. And so, I mean, I think that the righteous mind, the specific theory that was put out in that book, has just been fairly well refuted, in the sense that many of the values that he assigned to the right have been clearly demonstrated on the left since he published that book. Group loyalty. I mean, I'm not going to get into a full-blown analysis of his value theory, but it's certainly flat and binary. And I therefore think it doesn't transcend the modernist level and is generally nowhere near as explanatorily powerful as integral philosophy.
I have nothing to add.
I'll just add briefly. I feel like, one of the things I learned in those conversations with Jonathan back in 2014, I guess, is that, he is a species of sort of super smart intellectual modernist kind of that are almost like, well, that, as understanding sort of integral developmental stages, you can kind of speak that language and they hear you, and he heard us. He was like, oh, you all are interesting, but which was cool, and he was like, and there was almost like a proto-integral sensibility in his thinking, right? And so we start to feel like we can kind of connect and see things together and look through that same lens. And of course, you like, and there's a lot more people like him now, and you'd like for those people to be really influential and powerful. But getting to a hierarchical developmental stages in some form or other, getting to postmodernism as being really deeply relevant it is a very difficult journey with those guys. And I have my own ideas about why that is, but I think it has to do with consciousness and that whole world. And that's just like, that's a step too far. They can't go there. And so it was very interesting to see like the common cause that could be made, but then the gap that was also there. And I worry that gap is ultimately a big gap to get across wherever they would need to get to actually kind of be in a camp like this, So, but love Jonathan, I wish him more and more influence.
Great. All right. We're moving right along. Next question is from Kevin Rubel. I agree with the premise that the healing of divisions requires not compromise, but an integral approach, which addresses and incorporates the values of the various memes, and understand how this might look for traditionals, moderns, and postmoderns. Yet, it seems like self-interest, even at the expense of others, is the prime motivator for the red warrior level. Is it possible to incorporate the reds in this process? If not, what then are we to do with the reds? Is the answer to marginalize them?
Wow. Well, I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, red's the problem. It's just across the board. And these are people who are, and I'm not going to use this, I don't mean this as an insult, they're pre-civilized. Civilization happens at blue. And that's when you learn to sit down and shut up and join the group and have a transcendent God. And guilt comes online instead of shame, which is the feature of red. And so, we can see that. It's cross-cultural. There's different cultures have higher strata, bigger strata of red. We all have red in our own personal strata, and sometimes it takes over. And this is where I think integral helps, because integral wants to integrate. What's the upside of red? And the upside of red is the ability to fight, and to sort of bring that forward into an integral situation, which would be, the violence would be taken away. And in pure red, of course, violence is a feature. So there's that passion, there's playfulness, there's fun. There's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be brought forward from these pre-civilized memes. I'm just reading a book now on the Indian Wars in the 1800s. And of course, a lot of Indians capitulated and tried to become farmers and went in the reservations, and it was awful in many ways. But there were the ones who were wild, and they knew what the options were. They had visited Washington, D.C., had meetings with the Great Father. They wanted to be wild. And so there are people in the culture that's where they're at. And it is a challenge to contain them. And I do think that part of the evolution is going to be integrating the sort of wild, rude part of that into a further integration. So that's my stab at it.
I'll just say, I'll add that that's great, Jeff. I mean, there's a lot of red in culture right now, more, right? As traditionalism loses power, man, you see it. It's powerful. There's just in the cultural water, there's a lot of red, a lot. Now, when people are actually at red, yes, I mean, you got to contain, marginalize. You can't let them run the show, right? But marginalize, contain, and channel. I mean, I love the fact that, every Saturday in America or every Saturday and Sunday, 10 to 20 million people probably are in stadiums or screaming at their televisions, channeling a lot of red, and I'm one of them. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. We figured out a lot of ways to channel those instincts in all kinds of powerful ways. So you can't suppress it fully. You got to channel it. You have to marginalize, you have to contain, but you also have to allow it to exist and channel in all kinds of ways that aren't destructive,
Thanks, Carter and Jeff. That was great. I can add, first, let me kind of say a few things to frame this. For those who are not familiar with the spiral dynamics color jargon, we're talking about a cultural structure, a structure of agreements that has persisted in various forms for thousands of years. The polite label I use for it is pre-traditional, right? It's before the emergence of the civilizing influences of traditional culture and consciousness. In my 2007 book, Developmental Politics, I try to come up with names that for each of these major structures of culture that would give them dignity and describe what they were without color jargon. And the name that I came up with for this structure was warrior consciousness or warrior culture. And of course, pre-traditional cultures before contact, right, with Western civilization or colonialism have so many beautiful and noble aspects, right? You think about the ancient indigenous Americans or the ancient Hawaiians, right? There's so many romantic and beautiful features of those cultures that I think it's pretty evident that they had things we've lost, that they had insights, they had connections to nature, they had a kind of a fierce reality. Some of the romantic writers in the 19th century wrote about the immediacy of the art of pre-traditional consciousness, right? So the African mask, right? And that same immediacy translates into all kinds of versions of art that we can see in the modern age. Like, so gangster rap is clearly an expression of pre-traditional consciousness, and it's invigorating, right? I mean, it's stimulating. It speaks to that, at least in many cases, repressed psychological element that people have, and so it provides a kind of a liberating feeling. In my generation, it was punk rock music that had the same effect. Very pre-traditional. Screw the Queen and all kinds of kind of anarchist tropes that were mostly confected radicalism, but nevertheless. I think we need to kind of make a distinction between the nobility and the beauty of pre-traditional cultures in their kind of untranscended state, and the stubborn remnants of pre-traditional consciousness as it exists within, let's just say America for purposes of easy reference, right? So anywhere you see gang culture or prison culture, that's a current expression of pre-traditional culture in the context of our current civilization. It's not limited to any one racial group, right? We have white skinheads and we have Hmong street gangs. I mean, every ethnic and racial group just about, can point to, for the most part, wayward youth that are recruited into this form of culture. And this form of culture, it's kind of a trap. It's like being kind of subject to being an addict to it. And the reason why we can't just sort of accept it is that it is anti-civilizational, in the sense that, for example, if you have a company, if you're the head of a company or the head of an HR department, if you hire people who have warrior consciousness, they are going to inevitably steal, lie, cheat, disrupt, harass. I mean, they are a kind of a cancer within any kind of organizational culture, for the most part. Now, again, there are people who have strong tendencies of this psychological proclivity, but have it kind of, it's kind of contained, right? So Carter mentioned sports, right? So that raw aggression that we see channeled into sports is a great example of warrior consciousness being kind of contained within a civilizing structure of traditional rules, and regulations and hierarchies and authorities, right? So football, for example, is a classic example of how the warrior instinct can thrive and be at least a partially good thing in the context of a blue structural container, or traditional structural container. But the hard truth about traditional consciousness, especially in the current culture, is that we have to have a right to be prejudiced against it, not prejudiced against any individual person, because they're not types of people as much as they are types of consciousness, cultural consciousness within people. And so we need to do everything we can to never give up on the people who have not evolved beyond warrior consciousness, who are kind of trapped in that culture, who have formed their identity around it. Sometimes those who have experienced the transition to a healthy traditional kind of consciousness make the best counsel. Like, so former gang members are often the best counselors, for troubled youth, to help them kind of get on the right path and stop being criminals. But I think one of the most important insights that integral philosophy can bring to the current cultural dialogue is helping people identify these forms of culture, so that they don't confuse prejudice against that kind of culture from racial prejudice or ethnic prejudice or other kinds of prejudice. Because again, we can now see that every group in the United States has developed along this spiral of development and has people who make meaning from every one of these. I think that we can see that the people who are trapped in these pre-traditional pockets, that used to be called ghettos, for the most part, and there's plenty of rural examples of people who have warrior consciousness as well. But understanding that many of those people have been trapped there through no fault of their own, by the fact they just grew up on the street and they didn't have any alternative, and that there were indeed inherited traumas that the culture as a whole has received. So slavery, a gigantic trauma that's bound to have impact on prior generations. Now, of course, we have a growing and strong Black middle class, for example. So there are plenty of people who've managed to, even coming from a ghetto, managed to take advantage of the increasing opportunities for upward mobility that our society has created. But being able to see pre-traditional consciousness for what it is, to recognize that it's a form of almost like animal consciousness that needs to be tamed and brought within the embrace of a civilization that strives for virtue and fairness and all those other values which are not alive at that level. Now, of course, we could quibble about the borders of this, how some people are, again, most people, I would say, make meaning using more than one cultural structure. So it's usually inaccurate to talk about somebody as being a worldview, but clearly people who are intense criminals or gang members or other troubling members of society that if we begin to understand that this is a form of cultural consciousness that isn't just who they are, it's not a brain issue, it's an issue of cultural evolution. And this is one of the most direct ways that we can help evolve culture is by pulling up the folks who are still stuck at red and helping to diminish the percentage of red who knows, what it really is, but certainly, big enough to be of concern. And again, the theory of spiral dynamics, and as it's been refined and improved through its contact with integral philosophy, has one of its greatest insights is that it could see how the best remedy for the pathologies of a given level is the next level above it, right? So in other words, we see how pre-traditional consciousness is able to completely dupe progressive postmodern consciousness by just gaming the system, right? They're smart enough and strategic enough that can say the right things. And so, again, pardon the colors, but it's handy. Green, progressive postmodernism, in some ways, is an enabler of pre-traditional red consciousness. And the real remedy for the people who were stuck, the real way out, the most immediate and direct way out, is a healthy dose, a strong and forceful, kind of intervention almost by traditional consciousness. I mean, when I first did a seminar with Don Beck, right, he observed that when it comes to gang members and troubled youth, these well-meaning nonprofits had sent in these job counselors and career counselors to help these kids get back on track, and it was a complete failure, didn't do any good whatsoever. But then they brought in the Bikers for Christ, these tough guys who were Christians, and they had tremendous success in converting a significant percentage of the gang members to becoming productive members of society because they had that tough traditionalism. So as green dissolves blue, as Don Beck says, as progressive postmodern consciousness effectively delegitimizes and undercuts the cultural authority of traditional consciousness, then that unleashes, to use a cliche, the Pandora's box of red is flung open, and red runs riot, as we see to a certain degree in our current cultural situation. I don't want to, some have tried to make political points by exaggerating the threat of gangs and crime. And so it's important to get a proper perspective, not to downplay it too much, but not to exaggerate it to the point where it's over, it's given more power by, assuming that it has power. But anyway, I could go on talking about red. If I was thinking that when I went in 2022, when I did a podcast with Glenn Lowry, that I figured that this would be what we would talk about the entire podcast. We only got to it in the last 10 minutes. But again, that podcast is available in various places on our platform, easy to watch. If you want to watch the last 10 minutes of that, I'm talking to Glenn Lowry, who has no idea about integral philosophy, about this understanding. And I point to, for example, modernist sociologists, Black sociologists at Harvard, for example, Orlando Patterson being the most famous. And he has done a thoroughgoing cultural analysis of the ghetto and, had brought in nuances about how most of the people are just working class or, they're traditional. It's only this kind of a particular configuration of this larger cultural context, which he calls the street configuration. But he and his other sociologists, without using developmental theory at all, are able to point out how, this is a cultural problem. And of course, they even mention, the breakdown of the family as being a part of it. So we could spend an hour talking about the challenge of unintegrated warrior consciousness, but that's probably a good place to leave it for now.
Great. Those are fantastic answers. All right, moving on. Next question is from Michael Grady. I think it would be great to discuss how and if someone is in fact thinking developmentally, integrally about any issue. What are bedrock cornerstones? Can one have a passionate emotional position as an integralist?
Well, maybe I'll jump
Jeff,
in.
go for it.
Go for it. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the markers of integral consciousness is that although you might have sort of a residual first tier response to things, ultimately, and as quickly as possible, you befriend everybody. You see where everybody's coming from. And I think that's a marker of integral consciousness. And so, and you also, I mean, there are people, it's like Red challenges this, but people are coming from good faith. Now, if you know that somebody's red, you know that their good faith is egocentric. But if you assign good faith to most people, vast majority, then life gets interesting in a new way. And whatever passion you had been channeling into pointing out the logical inconsistencies of your political opponents, which is an endless game and of course easy enough, or just feeling vitriol and repulsion by different groups and ideas. Whatever passion was in that, and there's that's still available to you, but just befriending the whole system and all of humanity. I sometimes think that if somebody talked about themselves the way most of us talk about humanity and the culture, somebody would recommend that we go see a therapist. Just the self-loathing, and there's a collective self-loathing that is probably a feature of these times, because we have an alienation from modernity and a depression from postmodernity that we got to deal with. But to the degree that we can let the updraft in befriend everybody, at least in our minds and hearts, and we might have to get in the arena with them. We might have to be political enemies in a different kind of way, but we, kind of give up the hate, I think. Something like that.
Beautifully said. I would add, I guess I would add a couple things. I like to give up the hate. I think that you absolutely can have passionate emotional positions as an integralist. I don't think there's any question about all kinds of things, and about things that need to happen and things that shouldn't happen. But I do think that your positions they will be less narrow, they'll be less stuck, they'll be less, you'll be able to move around and shift. And even before we get to that, I just think it's also important to realize that psychology is not the same as cultural identification. We're talking about the cultural identification you have, how you make meaning at that level. That's not the same as people can have different individual psychologies and approach things in different ways, and so that's its own thing. So it's important to be clear about that. But I do think the two things I was going to point to is, like, you're even in the midst of maybe passionate feelings about all kinds of things in life and in society, your palette of empathy ideally has expanded now. And it's not just on a flat plane, right? It's on the vertical plane as well. And your palette of empathy to understand people, to appreciate where they're coming from, to engage them at different levels is expanded as well. And that, it doesn't mean you're not going to be passionate. It doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you don't get angry or whatever. It just means that your ability to see and feel. I like the word, you get think, you get feel, you get see. I like the word see, but your ability to feel or see at different layers and levels of consciousness and culture is expanded. And so your ability to kind of put yourself in the shoes of other people is expanded in all kinds of ways. And that's a very different kind of a approach to the world around you. And it leads to very different types of responses. And to bring back to what Jeff was saying about the hate, like the hate diminishes, but I think it's also like you kind of care about the whole thing, not just this one part, not just this part. You kind of you care about the whole thing, and the whole thing is different. Different things are happening at different places and different levels, and you can make those distinctions. It's not just a whitewash of one thing. It's all of these things. And so you can kind of make those distinctions in your own consciousness and care about all of these different things happening and appreciate all of that, and maybe not get too stuck on this particular little point in the evolution of consciousness and culture, or this particular little thing I care about over here. So I do think that is also a capacity that's really important as we kind of start to think and make meaning in these ways and at these levels.
Excellent. I want to affirm what you both said regarding increased sympathy and empathy for folks who you might have previously hated. At least one more element of this that I can add is that from a theoretical perspective, what integral consciousness does is it allows you to kind of step outside, turn subject into object of the primary worldview that provided your center of gravity, your cultural center of gravity, before you became identified with this integral cultural system of agreements. And for almost everybody who is authentically making meaning from this level of cultural development, they either came directly from modernism, mainstream modernity, or they came from progressive postmodernism. And I would say, while these numbers are moving around for the last 20 years, the vast majority of people who are in the integral community, at least, have come directly out of progressive postmodernism, because that's where the integral philosophy comes from to a large degree. It has both modernist and postmodern roots. But I would say that most of the people, and again, this is evolutionarily appropriate, right? Most of the people who are magnetized to this way of thinking are beginning to emerge beyond a progressive postmodern identity. But in my humble experience, the majority of people who are associated with the movement have not transcended progressive postmodernism, that they're still very green. And they're oblivious to it. In other words, they adopt the theory and they learn intellectually. They are able to spout the jargon, but when it comes to many of their political positions, cultural orientations, they can't see how much they're still using progressive postmodernism as their center of gravity. And at least from my perspective, one of the characteristics of integral culture is that it's a synthesis. That we recognize we have a duty to honor the entire spiral of development as much as we can, and to bring forward the best of every one of these into a larger cultural whole. And that duty of synthesis, if you are a radical Marxist and you think that capitalism is just pure theft, then you're going to have a hard time integrating modernity, right? Because the key, we certainly want to improve capitalism. Being an integralist doesn't necessarily make you, a capitalist or someone who's oblivious to the significant critiques and ways that capitalism can, be improved. It's inherent pathologies like any, cultural expression. But we want to integrate it. We want to improve it. We want to carry forward. If we want to see it crushed and overthrown and discarded, then that's going to interfere with our ability to make meaning from a synthetic level. Right. Likewise, when it comes to integrating, the very important foundational cultural gifts of traditional consciousness, if we think that religion is just a fairy tale, that anybody who believes in any kind of traditional religious notions is equivalent to believing in the tooth fairy, then you're going to have a hard time inhabiting an authentically synthetic position that could carry forward some of the, kind of eternally true elements. In other words, the ability to tease apart the dignities from the disasters, to recognize the enduring gifts of traditional religions, even while we, get rid of the ethnocentrism and the myths and the bigotry and all of the negative things that are still clearly associated with traditional consciousness. There's an element of that form of consciousness that's a permanent part of any level of higher civilization. And if you're in complete hostility to even the best aspects of these earlier worldviews, then I would argue that you're going to have a hard time gaining a mature integral perspective. Let's put it that way. So again, this is another excellent question that we could say a lot more on, but that's probably enough for now.
Yeah, that's great. All right, moving along. Next question is from Catherine Schultz. Wondering the role you see AI and virtual reality programs playing in the next rung of the spiral within culture, and if either of these emergent technologies might be used to support more brains within the culture to move into modernity at minimum.
I'll just say 2 quick points here. We have a lot of questions here, but this is a great one too. I mean, God, there's so much about AI. I was just looking at some AI stuff today. It's fascinating. And absolutely, I mean, it's certainly AI is being championed by modernity, and it's moving it forward in this powerful way. I'm sure it will continue to draw people into its cultural fold. But I do think there's something about AI that touches on consciousness. And I do think that ultimately that is going to push us up against the limits of understanding consciousness from a modernistic perspective. And that mixture of needing to understand a deeper sense of consciousness to deal with this thing we've unleashed, and the enormous complexity that this is going to kind of bring to culture. I mean, I think part of what Integral allows in this way, in this developmental view, it allows us to integrate in our own selves and in our responses to the world just a lot more complexity and not be so overwhelmed, and be able to make sense of it and be able to just, not just be, put it together in a very limited or linear or simplistic way. And we are going to need that quality so intensively as we unleash these complexifying technologies that are going to change our world. So I do think it's going to call for that need, but AI specifically is going to call for a deeper understanding, God help us, of what a human being is and what consciousness is and what all of this is about. And I think it's going to push us toward that precipice.
Steve, you want to go?
Okay, sure. So as people have probably heard, the Institute for Cultural Evolution created a chatbot, a 3-answer model, responsible left, responsible right, and then what we're calling depolarizing GPT. So I had some experience training that together with the data scientist that I worked with, David Rosado. And some of the answers are pretty insightful, but for the most part, they're more like an interactive index to a book on integral consciousness. There's no real synergistic insights that I was able to see. The kind of the banality of the answers leads me to conclude that it's going to be a long time before we have anything close to integral consciousness, authentic integral consciousness from an AI. And that skepticism is bolstered by my analysis of the current culture of in the tech industry around AI and among the press corps that covers it. There's a dominant assumption that artificial general intelligence, right, like human-like, flexible, almost self-aware AI is just around the corner. 5 years, it's inevitable. Soon we're going to have these digital agents that have their own purposes and that threaten the extinction of humanity. And AGI is just kind of like a background assumption. So to counter that assumption, I wrote an article last year in June. Again, it's on the developmentalist.org website called The Spiritual Implications of AI, where I argued at length that I don't think artificial general intelligence is possible. That the assumption that that's just coming down the road is based on a highly reductionistic, materialistic misunderstanding of what consciousness is and how it works, and that somehow that the brain is producing it. And that fundamental philosophical, spiritual mistake is leading to all kinds of bad policy and just bad predictions. And it's kind of hampering our ability to deal with the real threats that the existing kinds of AI already pose. But the fascination, the sort of science fiction fantasy of AGI on the horizon is so tempting and so seductive for so many of the people who are writing about AI that it's become a kind of a groupthink around it. And so I reject that and think that artificial intelligence will certainly contribute to cultural evolution in all kinds of ways. But I think that it's going to be a long time before it can make meaning at the level that we're talking about without millions of dollars of investment and training so that it can kind of fake you out. Certainly no small nonprofit efforts like we've done in terms of the training and the data that we've used is going to come anything close to integral consciousness, despite the fact that I'm proud of depolarizing GPT and encourage you to check it out and share with us any particularly integrally authentic answers you may get. I remain skeptical about how transformative of our civilization this technology will be.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, because I agree with both of you, that there's not a shred of intention or consciousness in anything that I've seen. And so I don't think we're going to create, it's like the difference between a hole on it and a heap in Wilberian terms. I mean, computers, no matter how complex, they don't have the structure of holonic emergence. Humans do, and where I think there may be some room for wild speculation is with the implanting of neurons in our own brains, and so we're still human, but we have superhuman powers of cognition and so forth. I don't know. That sort of worries me more than the machines that we create. I do think that there is a new world arising where it's like the move from information processing, which was the computer age, to concept processing, where, for instance, I could have a session with a AI therapist that would be very good. It wouldn't be alive, there wouldn't be a there, but it would integrate the best of, what helped people like me in situations, whatever it does. And it's like, I've been helped enormously by books, which is, also a sort of a third person transmission of thought. So, I think there's lots that, I guess I'll end by just saying, I'm glad I'm old because I don't know. And it's going to be a different world. And man, evolution accelerates until we all pop, right? But go on. I'll stop there.
Good words, Jeff. Good words.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not like literally pop into just like a whole big pile of protoplasm, but we'll see.
Hopefully not. Okay. Still got time for a few more questions. Next one is from Trudy. And just want to give a shout out to Trudy for giving us the idea. She threw out the idea that we have a panel discussion. So here we are doing just that. All right. This one, it says to Steve, could you please describe in clear, concise language, how does cultural evolution work? In other words, how does an individual's expanded awareness or consciousness influence others or the cosmos? Or conversely, how does the cosmos influence us or expand consciousness?
Well, that's a simple question. I should be able to answer that in about 3 or 4 sentences. But seriously, because we're 15 minutes left, let's just try to do a lightning round so we can get through these questions. And even though that question deserves at least an hour's answer, my kind of lightning round response is that culture evolves because people try to make their life conditions better. And as forms of better manifest, people agree that that's better. And that creates a specific kind of an agreement, a powerful kind of agreement, a value agreement. And that value agreement is like, it's a living thing in a way. It lives in this intersubjective realm, and it has a metabolism of energy. Value agreements are like channels of energy, because value itself is like a form of energy. And then as people agree about what's better and about how to make things better, those agreements build up, like words in a language, to create worldview structures, which are the basic units of cultural evolution. And those worldview structures have, a beginning, a middle, and then they start to grow old. And the larger forces of evolution, which are present at every level, cosmological, biological, and psychosocial, those forces of evolution have a particularly strong impact on the mind of human beings. They impact all life is striving to survive and reproduce. So value gravity can be felt, at every level. But humans can feel this pull of the potential for a better way. They're as part of their free will. They can always imagine how things could be better. And that means that human needs can never be satisfied. And so this quest for a better way has been driving human cultural evolution for at least the last 50,000 years, if not for the entire length of our species' existence. And so, how do values spread? I mean, part of it is the kind of the work of integral philosophy. Almost every proposition in our kind of a philosophical oeuvre is about how value agreements build up into worldviews, how worldviews conflict with each other, how new worldviews emerge, how worldviews fail or succeed, how worldviews color human culture, and constitute the essential structures of noosphere evolution itself. So again, there's so much more to say, and such an excellent question. Thank you. But let me just stop there.
Carter, go ahead.
No, it wasn't to me. That's good. We can keep going.
Yeah.
Well, let me just share what I wanted to share then, and that is, I think of cultural and consciousness evolution as just built into the system, and I will share 3 stanzas from one of my favorite poems, "Song of Myself" by Walt Whitman, and he's one of our great integral grandfathers. And here's what he has to say. He says, "Urge and urge and urge, always the procreant urge of the world. Out of the dimness, opposite equals advance, always substance and increase, always sex, always a knit of identity, always distinction, always a breed of life. To elaborate is no avail. Learned and unlearned feel that it is so." So I won't elaborate further. I'm not supposed to.
More poetry.
Yeah.
All right. Next one is to Jeff. This is from Trudy as well. And Jeff, you can start off, and then you other guys can chime in as well. All right. Your daily Evolver podcasts are beloved by the integral community, including me. You have a way of coming across as very folksy, but speaking with conviction. Do you ever have doubts? And if so, about what?
Well, it's interesting that you should ask, because I feel like I'm ending an era with the Daily Evolver, and I've said all I have to say. I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over, and I'm glad it's beloved, and I'm glad there are people who want to hear me, but I may be I may be sort of retiring. I mean, I feel like I want to put stuff out when I want to put it out, but I don't want to work under a schedule of 2 a month, which I haven't posted them all, but that's what I've been doing. And so, maybe it's that, and maybe it's just that as I'm diving more into the cultural soup, especially through Twitter, I am, first of all, I'm feeling like the world is moving. There's a lot of good stuff that's happening in the intelligentsia, and I don't feel as needed anymore in that way. I feel like the ball is rolling, so that's another piece of it. And yeah, so those are my doubts. Thank you for asking.
That relates to the next question, so let's move on to that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. All right. The next one is from Bert Parley. What are the second thoughts, confusions, and or new learnings that you are able to share with us related to your own truth-seeking process?
I'll jump into this one. I mean, I think Bert, I don't know if I presented in the last month, and it was really the answer to this question. Thinking a lot about postmodernism and its role and its problems and its deficiencies and its role in whatever's coming next, and if there's some future integral renaissance, as Steve likes to call for, how would that happen and what would that look like? And are we at the end of the Roman Empire or the beginning of the Enlightenment, or where are we in history? These are the doubts and questions that flow through my mind. And so I presented a lot on that and had some kind of new leanings on that. And the fact that there has been this cultural reaction to postmodernism that has really become quite strong now in a good way, even though it has problems. This reactivity to postmodernism has been very healthy. But now I think it's created new dynamics in culture that as integralists we have to recognize. So all of that, and in my own life, I have sort of dived into the psychedelic world some. And I think that has also made me think about the role of the psychedelic renaissance in culture, and how the role that's going to play in postmodern culture, and the role that will play in the overall development of culture, and just all those things of kind of trying to grapple with all those things.
Yeah. I'll just add a quick answer to what's next for me. It's funny and it surprises me in a certain way, but where the juice is for me is kind of being a grandpa. And I realized I was raised with rednecks, and people in their I'm about to turn 70. People in their 70s aren't about achieving. They're about like tending the garden, they're about cooking, they're about the family. And I'm very drawn to that these days. And I'm just grateful for that and allowing it to happen. Maybe I'm retired.
Steve, before you go, can I add an addendum to mine just briefly? I thought, I think with the social justice movement, even though I see the goals of it, the wokeness was such a problematic movement, and has been, and so many, you just like, oh. And I think when I saw like the psychedelic renaissance start, even though it's got its own issues, it's like, oh, maybe the consciousness part of postmodernism can push this spiral forward a little more. Maybe postmodernism has some life in it, and maybe that is really important for what needs to come next. And I think seeing that helped me change my perspective on that worldview a bit. So I just wanted to add that.
Sure. Thanks for that good question, Bert. Kind of a soul-searching one. I would say that I have doubts and second thoughts and second guesses all the time. I think there's a positive and negative element of that. Um, I think that the positive element is being self-critical, right? And thinking for yourself and questioning authority and questioning received wisdom and generally being, master of your own opinions. And one of the things about both traditional culture and progressive postmodern culture is that there's a huge pressure of conformity, a huge pressure of kind of going along with the group. And that achieves some evolutionary results, right? Positive social norms. It's not all bad. Modernity in the middle kind of breaks out of the conformist consciousness of traditionalism by being highly critical. And indeed, one of the fruits of that criticality is humor, right? So, the humor flourishes within modernity, right? The whole thing about stand-up comics, that's all very much a modernist expression. And you don't see so much of it at traditional or postmodern, which is part of the reason why many professional comics now refuse to give their routines at college campuses because they don't have a sense of humor anymore because they're not willing to be self-critical, which is part of the job of humor. But beyond that, beyond always trying to pour acid on any received wisdom, including integral wisdom, I have personal doubts. I have personal doubts about my ability to be a good enough philosopher to make any meaningful difference. I have doubts about whether this integral worldview that I've dedicated my life to will emerge out of obscurity during my lifetime, right? I mean, these are important doubts to have, I guess, because we want to be realistic. But at the same time, among my spiritual practices is a virtues practice. And I've selected a group of virtues. That's our exercise. People can select their 7 virtues that they want to try to live up to. And among the virtues on my list are hope and faith. I don't necessarily mean, blind faith to a belief system, but basic faith that all things eventually work together for good and hope that that's true. And so practicing those virtues is not inconsistent with doubt, but when I feel myself being disheartened by doubt, I remember the virtues that I've committed to and commit to being hopeful and faithful in the project that I've undertaken.
Thank you for your
Very good.
openness, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Bert.
That's a great answer. And that might be the answer we need to end on because I think I don't think we're gonna have time for another question. But this has been fantastic, you guys. I hope we do this again. And